My name is Nora Sterling. 11 years ago, the moment my son was born with a disability, my entire family turned their backs on us. They looked at my baby and said, "He's not our blood," before cutting us out of their lives as if we had never existed. There are memories that fade with time, and then there are the ones that stay so sharp you can still feel them years later. I believed love was the one thing that could survive anything, that family always found a way back to each other. I carried that belief with me for far too long. What I didn't know was that some people don't walk away all at once. They do it one cold glance, one unanswered call, one impossible choice at a time, until one day you look around and realize you're standing completely alone. The envelope sat exactly in the center of the mahogany table. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock, sealed with a gold leaf wax stamp of our family crest. But if you looked closely at the bottom right corner, the paper was bruised. The fibers were crushed. My father had been gripping it so tightly, his thumb had left a permanent indentation. He sat across from me, his posture rigidly straight, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. He didn't look at my face. He looked at the envelope. "It's a family reunion, Nora," he said, his voice a practiced boardroom baritone. "We want you and the boy to attend. It's time to put the past behind us." I didn't blink. I just watched the pulse ticking faintly at the base of his throat. He wasn't here to reconcile. He was here because he needed something, and his pride was currently losing a war against his desperation. He had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought I was still the terrified, exhausted 24-year-old girl he had thrown out into the rain 11 years ago. He had no idea what I had built in the dark. Before I tell you what I slid back across the table to him, if you're new here, please like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. And let me know where you're watching from in the comments. To understand why my father's pulse was racing, you have to understand the architecture of my childhood. We didn't just live in our cliffside Newport estate, we performed in it. The house always smelled of sea salt, polished cedar, and the faint metallic tang of my mother's expensive perfume. It was a beautiful, suffocating museum where perfection was the only accepted currency. In our family, there was a strict hierarchy. My father, Nathan, was the architect of our public image. My mother, Helen, was the curator. My older brother, Trent, was the exhibit. He was charming, athletic, and entirely hollow. He was handed every opportunity, every failure forgiven, every success magnified. Then there was me, Nora. I was the foundation, the invisible load-bearing wall. While Trent was at Yale networking at parties, I was in the study at midnight, balancing my father's offshore accounts and rewriting his corporate speeches. I was the one who noticed when the housekeeper was skimming and the one who quietly fixed it before my mother could fire her and cause a scene. I thought my utility was my value. I thought if I just worked hard enough, I would earn my place at the table. I was 22 when I met Toby's father. He was a brilliant, quiet software engineer named David. He saw right through my family's polished veneer. When I got pregnant, I was terrified, but David was thrilled. We moved into a tiny, drafty apartment in Boston. I was happy. For the first time, my worth wasn't tied to my last name. But happiness, in my family, was considered a breach of contract. Toby was born on a Tuesday. He was perfect. Until he wasn't. At 6 months old, Toby stopped making eye contact. By 9 months, he lost the ability to sit up. The doctors ran tests after test in a clinic that smelled of antiseptic and cold coffee. Finally, the neurologist sat us down and delivered the diagnosis: a rare, severe neurodegenerative disorder. Toby would never walk. He would likely never speak. He would require clock-around care for the rest of his life. I was devastated, but I was also immediately fiercely protective. I went home, packed our bags, and called my father. I needed help. I needed my family. I drove to Newport the next day. I remember the exact sound of the gravel crunching under my tires as I pulled into the circular driveway. I walked into the sunroom, where my parents and Trent were having afternoon tea. I didn't even get to finish explaining Toby's condition before my mother set her porcelain teacup down with a sharp clack. "We ran the genetic panels, Nora," my father said, not looking up from his newspaper. "The defect doesn't exist in our lineage." I froze. "What are you talking about?" He finally looked at me, his eyes completely dead. "We know about the other man, and we know the boy isn't ours." The silence in the sunroom was absolute, save for the rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. I just looked at my father, analyzing the micro-tensions in his jaw. He wasn't angry. He was relieved. "The geneticist explained it," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "It's a recessive mutation. It can skip generations. David and I were both carriers. It's biology, Dad, not infidelity." My mother, Helen, finally looked up from her tea. Her eyes were dry, calculating. "Biology doesn't matter, Nora. Optics do. We are hosting the mayor's gala in 6 months. We cannot have a defective child running through the halls. It reflects poorly on the family's genetic health." Defective. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Trent leaned back in his wicker chair, swirling his scotch at 3 in the afternoon. "Look, it's nothing personal, but Nicole and I are trying to conceive. If people start whispering that there's bad blood in the family tree, it'll tank my father-in-law's investment in my startup. You understand." Nicole, sitting beside him, offered a tight, sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We just want what's best for the family's legacy. Maybe you could place him somewhere, a state facility. Then you could start over, marry someone clean." I looked at the 4 people who shared my DNA. In that single crystalline moment, the illusion of my entire life shattered. They didn't love me. They didn't love Toby. They loved the reflection he cast of them. "I'm not placing him anywhere," I said. My voice didn't shake. "And I'm not giving him up." My father set his newspaper down. The finality in his movement was absolute. "Then you are no longer a Sterling. You have until midnight to remove your belongings. Your access to the family accounts is revoked. If you walk out that door with that boy, you will never step foot on this property again. You will receive no inheritance, no safety net, and no help. You will be entirely on your own." It was a threat designed to break me. He expected me to beg. He expected me to realize that a 23-year-old girl with a disabled infant couldn't survive in the real world without the Sterling name. "Understood," I said. I stood up and walked out of the sunroom. I didn't look back. Upstairs, I packed Toby's medical equipment, his clothes, and his specialized feeding tubes. As I was zipping his diaper bag, my eyes caught sight of a dusty, battered wooden lockbox tucked beneath my bed. It had belonged to my maternal grandfather. My father had tried to throw it away years ago, calling it sentimental garbage. I had secretly kept it. I pulled it out. It was heavy. Inside wasn't money or jewelry, but a collection of my grandfather's old handwritten engineering notebooks and a strange encrypted-looking brass cipher disk. My father had always dismissed my grandfather as an eccentric tinkerer, but looking at the complex algorithms scribbled in the margins of the top notebook, I realized my father had missed something crucial. I shoved the box into my suitcase. At 11:45 p.m., I carried Toby down the grand staircase. The house was dead silent. My family was already asleep, or perhaps just pretending to be, sparing themselves the discomfort of a goodbye. I walked out into the freezing November rain. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing like a vault locking. I drove to a cheap, fluorescent-lit motel on the outskirts of the city. The room smelled of stale smoke and bleach. I laid Toby on the stiff mattress, hooked up his monitors, and watched his chest rise and fall. I had $42 in my personal checking account. I had no job, no home, and a medically fragile infant. My father thought he had just stripped me of everything. He thought I would come crawling back within a month. He didn't know I had just taken the one thing he couldn't control, and he certainly didn't know what was hidden inside my grandfather's wooden box. The fluorescent light of the motel room hummed at a frequency that made my teeth ache. It was 5 a.m. Toby was awake, his breathing shallow and rhythmic through his specialized feeding tube. I measured out his metabolic formula to the exact milliliter. Every drop cost 40 cents. I did the math in my head. His daily nutritional and medical requirement was $18. I had $42 in my personal checking account. That gave me 2 days of life. I sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled my grandfather's wooden box onto my lap. My father had always called Arthur a tinkerer who died with nothing, but as I opened the brass latch, the smell of aged paper and machine oil filled the stale room. Inside were 6 leather-bound notebooks. I opened the top one. The pages were filled with dense, handwritten schematics. It wasn't just engineering, it was a foundational architecture for asynchronous data routing. My father ran a logistics empire. He moved physical freight, but my grandfather was trying to move digital freight. In 1989, he had conceptualized a way to compress data packets so efficiently it would make traditional server farms obsolete. He never patented it. He died of a stroke before he could file the paperwork. I traced the brass cipher disk resting on top of the pages. It wasn't a toy, it was a physical decryption key. The numbers aligned with a sequence in the margins. My father hadn't just dismissed my grandfather's work, he had actively ignored it because he didn't understand it. He was a man of the physical world, he couldn't see the digital one. But I could. I had spent the last 4 years secretly optimizing my father's company software from the shadows. I recognized the genius in those pages immediately. I needed capital to build a prototype. I reached into the lining of my coat and pulled out the only thing I had smuggled out of the house before my father revoked my accounts, a pair of flawless 3-carat diamond stud earrings, my 20th birthday gift from my mother. She had given them to me with a cold smile, saying, "Wear these when you marry well." I walked 3 miles to a pawn shop downtown, pushing Toby in his heavy, rusted stroller. The bell above the door chimed. The pawnbroker, a man with grease under his nagelin fines, looked at the earrings, then at Toby's medical equipment, and finally at my face. "$2,000, he said. "They're flawless VVS1 clarity, and the setting is platinum, not white gold. $4,000. He scoffed. "Lady, look at you. You need the money. I'm doing you a favor." I didn't argue. I just picked up the earrings and walked toward the door. "Wait," he called out. "$3,500, final offer." I turned back, took the cash, and didn't say a word. I bought Toby's formula, a prepaid burner phone, and a cheap, refurbished laptop from a second-hand electronics store. I returned to the motel, set up my workstation on the rickety desk, and opened my grandfather's notebook to page 42, ready to begin coding. That's when I noticed something. The page had been razor-cut from the binding. Someone hadn't just ignored my grandfather's work, someone had been looking for this specific algorithm, and they'd torn it out before I ever found the box. I looked at the brass cipher disk in my hand. If page 42 was the core logic, then whoever took it had a massive head start. My burner phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I answered it. "Hello?" "Nora," a voice said. It was my brother, Trent. His tone was entirely stripped of its usual lazy charm. "Dad says you took Grandpa's junk. Bring it back. Now." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at the cheap plastic of the burner phone and processed the data. Trent had my number, but I had purchased this phone 45 minutes ago with cash. The pawnbroker hadn't asked for my ID, and I hadn't connected it to any of my old accounts. There was only one logical explanation. He hadn't tracked the phone. He had tracked my car. "How did you get this number, Trent?" I asked, my voice perfectly flat. There was a pause on the other end. The slight hesitation told me everything. He hadn't expected me to answer, let alone deduce his method. "Does it matter?" he deflected, his tone shifting from demanding to a forced, brotherly concern. "Look, Nora, Dad's worried about you. It's been a stressful few days. Just bring Grandpa's box back to the estate. We'll talk this out like family." "I don't have a family, and I don't have the box. It was empty." "Don't play games with me, Trent," Trent snapped, the charm evaporating instantly. "We know you took it. Dad's new proprietary logistics software is failing. The routing algorithms are bottlenecking, and the board is breathing down his neck. We need Grandpa's notes to patch the architecture. Bring it back, or Dad will have his lawyers trace your vehicle and repossess it. You'll be stranded." A quiet, profound clarity washed over me. The puzzle pieces were finally aligning. My father hadn't ignored my grandfather's work. He had stolen it. He had taken the intact notebooks, reverse-engineered the foundational architecture, and built his company's multi-million-dollar logistics software on top of my grandfather's genius. But he was missing page 42. He was missing the keystone algorithm. That was why his software was bottlenecking. He was trying to run a complex digital ecosystem on an incomplete physical foundation. He didn't just disown me because Toby was disabled. He disowned me to cut off my access to the estate, ensuring I couldn't find the box before he did. He thought he had secured the asset. He didn't realize I had already smuggled it out. "You're not calling about a patch, Trent," I said, watching Toby's monitors to ensure his oxygen levels remained stable. "You're calling because your software is collapsing. If you don't have the core logic from page 42, your entire network crashes by the end of the month." Silence stretched over the line. I could hear his breathing, sharp and panicked. I had just confirmed his deepest, most closely guarded corporate secret. "You have no idea what you're messing with," Trent whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. "Dad will ruin you. I swear to God, Nora, he will bury you in litigation." "He can try, but litigation requires a company, and you won't have one if you don't figure out how to bypass the bottleneck without my grandfather's code." I pressed the red button, ending the call. I immediately powered the phone down and removed the SIM card, snapping it in half. The motel was no longer safe. Trent knew I was in the city, and he knew I had the car. I had exactly 20 minutes before his private security team arrived to repossess my vehicle and search the room. I moved with practiced efficiency. I packed Toby's medical supplies, folded the blankets, and secured the wooden box in my canvas tote. I slipped Toby into his car seat, his eyes tracking my movements with quiet, unblinking focus. He was so observant. Even now, at 11 months old, he noticed patterns others missed. I slipped out the back exit of the motel, avoiding the main road, and walked a half-mile through the freezing drizzle to a 24-hour diner on the edge of the industrial district. The place smelled of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. I paid for a corner booth in cash and ordered nothing. I set up my refurbished laptop on the sticky Formica table. I plugged in the Ethernet cable from the diner's public terminal and opened a secure browser. I needed to know exactly how much leverage I held. I searched for my father's company's recent SEC filings and cross-referenced them with the specific software bottleneck Trent had mentioned. The results populated the screen in seconds. My father's company hadn't just signed a new contract. 3 days ago, they had finalized a massive make-or-break merger with a global tech conglomerate. But buried on page 47 of the filing was a brutal performance clause. If the logistics software wasn't fully optimized and delivered by the end of the month, the merger would collapse, triggering a penalty that would legally bankrupt the Sterling estate. He didn't just need the notebook to fix a glitch, he needed it to save his entire empire. And I was the only person on Earth who held the missing piece. The neon sign outside the diner window buzzed with a faint, erratic hum, casting a sickly pink glow across the sticky Formica table. I ignored it. My entire world had narrowed to the glowing screen of the refurbished laptop and the rhythmic, shallow rise of Toby's chest. I didn't panic. Panic is a luxury for people with safety nets. I simply opened a secure, encrypted terminal and began to type. I needed to verify my leverage. I couldn't just threaten my father with the missing page 42. I had to understand exactly what that page contained. Using the brass cipher disk, I aligned the physical tumblers with the sequence written in the margins of the notebook. The disk clicked into place, revealing a secondary layer of microtext hidden beneath the primary schematics. It wasn't just a data routing algorithm. As I translated the microtext into a digital script, the true nature of my grandfather's invention revealed itself. He hadn't just built a way to compress data, he had built a cryptographic shadow ledger. The algorithm was designed to fragment financial transactions into millions of untraceable micropackets, routing them through decentralized nodes so efficiently that no regulatory body on Earth could track the flow of money. My father wasn't just using this for corporate logistics, he was using it to launder money. The missing page 42 contained the master decryption seed. Without it, the shadow ledger was just a scrambled mess of useless data, but with it, whoever held the seed controlled billions of dollars in hidden, illicit assets. My father's company wasn't just facing a software bottleneck, it was facing a federal indictment. If the SEC or the FBI ever realized what he was actually running through his network, he wouldn't just lose the merger, he would lose his freedom. I sat back, the cold coffee in my mug forgotten. The stakes had just shifted from corporate bankruptcy to federal prison. I was no longer holding a patch for a glitchy software program. I was holding the detonator to my father's entire empire. Before I could process the magnitude of this, a sharp, high-pitched alarm shattered the quiet of the diner. It was Toby's pulse oximeter. I snapped my attention to my son. His lips were taking on a faint, terrifying blue tint. His hands, usually still, were trembling as his body fought for oxygen. The stress of the cold, the move, and the change in his environment had triggered a respiratory spasm. His airway was closing. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly steady. I couldn't take him to the emergency room. If I used my real name or if I swiped my old insurance card, my father's fixers would have the hospital's security cameras flagged in less than 10 minutes. They would be waiting in the lobby. I had to stabilize him here. I grabbed my canvas tote and dug out his emergency rescue medication. I checked the dosage, my eyes darting between the vial and the clock on the wall. I administered the nebulizer treatment, holding the mask gently over his nose and mouth. "Breathe, Toby," I whispered, my voice a calm, steady anchor in the chaos. "Just breathe. I've got you." For 3 agonizing minutes, the only sound was the hiss of the nebulizer and the buzzing neon sign. I watched the color slowly return to his cheeks. The trembling in his hands stopped. The alarm on the monitor silenced. He was safe, for now. But the incident reinforced a brutal reality. I was running out of time, and I was running out of resources. I couldn't stay in the shadows forever. I needed a fortress. I needed to turn this stolen intellectual property into an impenetrable legal shield. I pulled up the diner's public registry and began forming a limited liability company. I used a registered agent service in Delaware, paying the fee with the last of my cash. I named the company Arthur Dynamics in honor of the grandfather who had unknowingly handed me the sword I needed to slay the dragon. Then, I took the compiled code from page 42, encrypted it with a 256-bit key, and uploaded it to a decentralized anonymous cloud server. I didn't send it to my father. I didn't send it to the authorities. I locked it away, and I buried the decryption key on a smart contract on the blockchain. I was no longer just a discarded daughter hiding in a diner. I was the sole shareholder of a ghost company that held the keys to a billion-dollar criminal enterprise. My burner phone was dead, but the diner had a landline. I picked up the receiver, dialed a number I had memorized years ago, and waited for the third ring. The rotary phone of the diner was coated in a fine, sticky layer of aerosolized grease. I wiped the receiver with a napkin before pressing it to my ear. The number I dialed belonged to a man who existed entirely outside the legal boundaries of my father's world. Elias Wance was a forensic accountant and corporate fixer. 20 years ago, my grandfather had quietly paid off Elias's gambling debts, and in return, Elias had promised my grandfather a single, untraceable favor. I was cashing it in. The line rang twice before a gruff, tired voice answered. "Vance." "Elias, it's Nora Sterling, Arthur's granddaughter." The silence on the other end was heavy. "Arthur's been dead for a decade, kid, and the Sterlings don't call me. What do you want?" "I want to schedule a meeting, and I want you to bring a non-disclosure agreement, a secure server, and a pot of coffee that doesn't taste like battery acid." He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "You sound exactly like him, cold as ice. Booth 4 at the Starlight Diner in 20 minutes. Don't bring a tail." I hung up. I didn't have a tail, but I did have a son who needed his next feeding. I prepared Toby's formula with mechanical precision, my mind already 3 steps ahead. When Elias walked in, he was a sharp contrast to the diner's grim aesthetic. He wore a rumpled tweed jacket, but his eyes were razor sharp, scanning the room before locking onto me. He slid into the booth, ignoring Toby's quiet, rhythmic breathing, and placed a thick manila folder on the table. "You said you had a job for me," Elias said, skipping the pleasantries. "I have a transaction," I corrected, sliding a single encrypted USB drive across the Formica. That drive contains a partial shadow ledger. It's routing millions through a decentralized node network. The host company is Sterling Logistics. Elias didn't touch the drive. His eyes narrowed. "Your father is laundering money, Nora? That's federal prison territory. Why bring this to me?" "Because I don't want to turn him in. Not yet," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I want to dismantle him, legally, financially, completely. I need you to set up a blind trust and a series of shell entities. I'm going to build a legitimate, superior version of his routing architecture, and I'm going to patent it. When his software inevitably fails without the missing decryption seed, his company will be worthless. I want to buy his debt for pennies on the dollar and foreclose on his estate." Elias stared at me. For the first time, he looked at me not as a child, but as a peer. "That requires millions in seed capital to build the infrastructure and file the patents. You're hiding in a diner with a sick baby. Where is the money coming from?" "That's what you need to arrange," I said. "Nora, no legitimate VC will touch you right now. Your father has already frozen your access and likely poisoned your reputation in the tech sector. He'll tell everyone you're unstable, a disgruntled daughter. Then we don't go to a legitimate VC. We go to an angel investor, someone who operates in the shadows, who doesn't care about my father's poison, and who has the liquidity to fund a $2 million seed round by Friday." Elias sighed, rubbing his temples. "There is only one person in this city with that kind of liquid cash who operates off the grid, but she has a strict personal vendetta against your family. If she finds out you're a Sterling, she'll throw you out on the street." "Who is she?" I asked. "Victoria Cross," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. "She runs the Cross Tech Incubator, and 10 years ago, your father stole her first major patent, drove her into bankruptcy, and ruined her reputation. She hates Nathan Sterling more than she hates oxygen." I looked down at Toby. His dark eyes were fixed on the neon sign outside, tracking the flickering pattern of the light. He saw the rhythm in the chaos. I needed to see it too. Set up the meeting, I said, sliding the USB drive back into my pocket. I'll handle Victoria. The Cross-Tech incubator didn't look like a startup hub. It looked like a fortress. Located in the city's brutalist financial district, the building was a monolith of dark glass and raw concrete. The air inside smelled of ozone and expensive espresso. I pushed Toby's stroller through the revolving doors, ignoring the stares of the security staff. I didn't ask for permission to enter. I simply walked to the executive elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse. Victoria Cross's office was a stark contrast to my father's mahogany and cedar museum. It was all sharp angles, exposed steel, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray skyline. Victoria stood behind a glass desk, her posture rigid. She was in her late 50s, with silver hair cut into a severe bob and eyes that looked like they could cut diamond. "Nora Sterling," she said, her voice like dry ice. "Elias said you had something to show me. He didn't mention you'd be bringing a Trojan horse. Get out." I didn't flinch. I parked Toby's stroller directly in the center of the room, unzipped my canvas tote, and placed the brass cipher disc on her pristine glass desk. My father's logistics network is currently routing $3 billion in untraceable microtransactions, but he's missing the decryption seed. Without it, his shadow ledger is just scrambled noise. I have the seed, and I have the architectural blueprints to build a legitimate, untraceable, and entirely legal version of it. Victoria stopped pacing. She looked at the brass disc, then at me. "You're 24. You've been disowned for 48 hours, and you're telling me you hold the kill switch to Nathan Sterling's empire? I'm telling you that if you don't fund me, I will walk across the street to the FBI and hand them the seed for a reduced sentence on my father's behalf." I lied smoothly. "But I'd rather watch him burn. I need $2 million in seed capital by Friday to incorporate, file the patents, and build the prototype. In exchange, I offer you 10% equity in Arthur Dynamics." Victoria laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. 10%? I hate your father more than I hate oxygen, Nora, but I'm not a charity. I want 51%. I want controlling interest. When his company collapses, I want to be the one who signs the foreclosure papers. "No," I said. She blinked, clearly not used to being denied. "Excuse me?" "You want controlling interest because you want revenge, but revenge is an emotion, and emotion makes you sloppy. I don't want your revenge. I want your infrastructure. I will give you 10% equity, which will be worth $40 million when we acquire his debt. But in exchange, you will provide me with your entire legal and forensic accounting team pro bono to draft the trap. You get your money, I get my family's destruction. We both win, but I drive." The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic hum of Toby's pulse oximeter. Victoria walked around the desk and leaned down, her face inches from Toby's. She studied his face for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then she looked up at me, her expression entirely changed. The hostility was gone, replaced with a cold, calculating curiosity. "His eyes," Victoria whispered. I frowned, my guard instantly spiking. "What about them?" "One is blue, the other is brown," she said, her voice dropping to a murmur. "Heterochromia, combined with the neurodegenerative markers your father was so desperate to hide." My breath caught in my throat just for a fraction of a second. "What secret?" Victoria walked back to her desk and opened a locked drawer. She pulled out a faded, handwritten medical file and slid it across the glass. "Open it," she commanded. I opened the file. The name on the top patient record wasn't Toby's. It was my father's, Nathan Sterling, dated 30 years ago. The manila folder felt unnaturally heavy in my hands. The paper inside was thick, the kind used for official hospital archives, and it smelled faintly of aged dust and sterile alcohol. I didn't rush. I unclasped the brass fastener with deliberate, measured movements, my eyes never leaving Victoria's face. She watched me with the quiet intensity of a predator observing a trap spring shut. I opened the file. The top document was a genetic sequencing report from a private clinic in Geneva, dated October 1994. The patient name was redacted, but the billing information at the bottom bore my father's signature. I read the diagnosis. Patient exhibits early onset markers for autosomal dominant neuromuscular degeneration, variant 4. Note, the patient's father, Arthur Sterling, has funded total record suppression and an experimental, unapproved enzyme therapy to mask the phenotypic expression. The genetic marker will remain clinically dormant in the patient, but carries a guaranteed transmission rate to offspring. The air in the room seemed to thin out. I didn't gasp, I didn't cry. I simply stared at the words until they blurred, my mind rapidly reconstructing the entire architecture of my life. Variant 4. It was the exact same neurodegenerative disorder Toby had been diagnosed with. Toby hadn't inherited a random mutation from David. David was merely a carrier of a benign, common genetic quirk. The lethal variant 4 came from the Sterling bloodline. My father had it. He had passed it to me as a dormant carrier, and when I passed it to Toby, it manifested in its full, unmasked severity. He knew, I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet perfectly steady. He knew exactly what Toby had. He just needed the world to think it came from me. He needed a scapegoat, Victoria corrected, her voice sharp. Your father is a narcissist, Nora. He cannot tolerate a flaw in his own design, so he projected it onto you. He destroyed your life to protect his stock price. I closed the folder and slid it back across the glass desk. The emotional weight of the betrayal was immense, but I locked it away in a steel vault in my mind. Emotions were useless here. Only leverage mattered. So he's not just hiding a software bottleneck, I said, looking up at Victoria. He's hiding a medical fraud. If this file goes public, his marriage to my mother collapses, his corporate image shatters, and the board will oust him for falsifying his executive health disclosures. Exactly, which is why you are going to build the prototype. You are going to patent the legal version of his shadow ledger, and when his company implodes, you will own him. Before I could answer, my refurbished laptop, which I had left open on the desk, emitted a sharp, rhythmic pinging sound. I turned to the screen. A terminal window had popped up, scrolling with lines of rapid-fire code. "What is that?" Victoria asked, stepping closer. "A brute force attack," I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard to isolate the intrusion. I checked the IP routing. The attack wasn't coming from a random botnet. It was coming from a private, military-grade cybersecurity firm. My father wasn't just sending his fixers to find me. He was trying to digitally obliterate me. And based on the speed of the decryption algorithm they were using, they were going to break through my firewall in less than 10 minutes. The progress bar on the terminal was a stark, blinking red line eating through my encryption. 99% was only 8 minutes away. I didn't feel a spike of adrenaline. Adrenaline causes shaking hands, and I needed mine perfectly steady. "They're using a distributed quantum decryption cluster," I said, my eyes tracking the cascading lines of code. My father didn't just hire a standard IT firm. They hired Blackwood Solutions. They don't just break passwords, they shatter the architecture holding them. Victoria stepped back from the desk, her face pale. "If they get the seed, they'll unlock the shadow ledger. They'll move the $3 billion offshore by midnight, and your leverage evaporates." "They won't get the seed," I replied. I pulled the brass cipher disk closer. The physical tumblers had given me the idea. My grandfather built this architecture to be physical. Digital brute force relies on predictable mathematical progression. I'm going to give them a mathematical ghost. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I didn't try to stop the attack. That would only prove I was protecting something valuable. Instead, I opened a back door. I created a honeypot, a flawless, highly complex decryption key that looked exactly like the master seed. But embedded deep within its subroutines was a logic bomb. The moment they integrated this fake seed into their shadow ledger to move the funds, it wouldn't unlock the money. It would permanently scramble the routing nodes. It would turn $3 billion into digital ash. "You're feeding them a poisoned apple," Victoria murmured, watching the screen. "I'm feeding them a mirror," I corrected. As I compiled the poisoned payload, I ran a secondary trace on the attack's origin. The IP addresses were bouncing through servers in Estonia, Singapore, and Sao Paulo, standard Blackwood protocol. But as the progress bar hit 80%, the system caught a microscopic metadata tag in the packet header, a routing preference for a specific private subnet. I froze. I ran the subnet ID through a public registry. The name that popped up made my breath catch just for a fraction of a second. "What is it?" Victoria asked. "It's not my father," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "The attack isn't coming from Sterling Logistics. It's coming from Trent's personal startup." If my father was trying to destroy me to protect his empire, Trent was trying to steal the ledger to save his own. He was bypassing his father, planning to take the $3 billion for himself. He was willing to let the family company burn as long as he walked away with the cash. If you've ever had to outsmart someone who fundamentally underestimated you, let me know in the comments. You'd be amazed at how many of us are fighting these quiet, invisible wars. I hit execute. The poisoned seed uploaded to the cloud server. On the screen, the brute force progress bar instantly halted at 99%. The red line turned green. Access granted. They had taken the bait. Trent's team was currently downloading the logic bomb, completely unaware that they were about to incinerate their father's empire and their getaway fund in a single keystroke. I leaned back, exhaling a slow, measured breath. The digital trap was set, but as I reached for my cold coffee, the heavy, silent landline on Victoria's desk began to ring. Victoria frowned. "That's a private line. Only 3 people have this number." She picked up the receiver. "Cross." I watched her face. The color drained from her cheeks so fast it looked like a physical blow. Her grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles turned white. She didn't say a word for 10 long seconds. Then she slowly lowered the receiver and looked at me, her eyes wide with an emotion I had never seen her display. Fear. "It's your mother, Nora," she said. "She says that Trent has filed an emergency mental health injunction. They are sending the sheriff to the building right now to take Toby into state custody." Victoria didn't move. The receiver dangled from its coiled cord, swaying slightly like a pendulum counting down our remaining seconds. I watched the micro-expressions on her face shift from shock to a cold, hardened resignation. "Why are you afraid of my mother?" I asked. My voice was perfectly level, cutting through the heavy silence of the office. "She's a socialite who curates flower arrangements. You're a tech titan who survived a corporate bloodbath. Why does a phone call from Helen Sterling make you look like you've seen a ghost?" Victoria slowly placed the phone back on its cradle. She didn't look at me. She looked at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the gray rain lash against the glass. "Because you've spent your whole life thinking your father was the architect of this family's empire, Nora. He wasn't. He was just the face. The shadow ledger, the offshore routing, the compliance structures that kept the SEC blind for 30 years, that was Helen. Your mother didn't just know about the money. She built the mathematical models to hide it. She's the one who hired Blackwood Solutions to crack your encryption. She's the one who realized Trent was trying to steal the fund, and she's the one who filed the injunction to stop him."
The puzzle pieces violently rearranged themselves in my mind. My mother hadn't been a passive enabler. She had been the operational mastermind. The teacup clinking in the sunroom, the cold dismissal of Toby, the immediate revocation of my accounts, it wasn't just about public image, it was about asset protection. Helen had realized that Toby's genetic diagnosis exposed the family's biological flaw, which threatened the corporate stock, which threatened the shadow ledger. She had cut me off to quarantine the liability. And the injunction? I asked, already calculating the legal parameters. It's not a mental health hold, Victoria said, turning back to me, her eyes sharp again. It's a writ of protective custody filed under the guise of medical neglect. Because you're living in a motel and buying formula with pawned jewelry, she's painted you as an unfit, destitute mother. The sheriff isn't here to take Toby to a state facility. He's here to take him to a private, Sterling-funded medical wing. They are going to seize physical custody of your son to use him as leverage. If you don't hand over the decryption seed, Toby stays in their tear indefinitely. A profound, icy clarity washed over me. They weren't just trying to ruin me, they were going to use my disabled son as a hostage to balance their criminal books. Grab his go bag. I zipped Toby's canvas tote with mechanical precision. I checked his oxygen levels on the monitor. Stable. We aren't running. Nora, if the sheriff takes him, you lose, Victoria urged, grabbing her coat. I can have my legal team file an emergency stay, but it will take hours. If we run, we look guilty, I replied, strapping Toby into his stroller. If we fight in the hallway, we look unstable. We are going to walk out the front door, and we are going to serve them. I pushed the stroller out of the office and into the private executive elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing us in a box of brushed steel and mirrored glass. I watched my own reflection. I didn't look like a destitute, frantic mother. I looked like a woman who had just been handed the final piece of the board. The elevator descended. Floor 40, floor 20, floor 10. When the doors chimed and opened to the marble lobby, 2 uniformed deputies were waiting by the security desk, alongside a man in a cheap suit holding a manila folder, the family's fixer. I didn't hesitate. I pushed the stroller directly towards them. The fixer stepped forward, a smug, triumphant smile on his face, holding out the custody papers. Nora Sterling, he said, his voice echoing in the vast lobby. By order of the family court, I am taking the child into protective custody. I didn't break stride. I stopped exactly 2 feet from him, reached into my coat, and pulled out a single sealed legal document. I handed it to the lead deputy, ignoring the fixer entirely. Officer, before you execute that writ, I need you to read the federal indictment I just filed against Helen and Nathan Sterling. You are no longer serving a custody order. You are serving as the primary arresting officers for a $3 billion money laundering conspiracy, and I am the star witness.
The heavy, embossed seal of the United States District Court sat stark against the cream-colored paper. I held it out, my arm perfectly steady. The fixer's smug smile faltered, his eyes darting from the document to my face, trying to read the bluff. But there was no bluff. The lead deputy, a broad-shouldered man with graying temples, took the envelope. He broke the seal and scanned the first page. I watched the exact moment his posture shifted. The casual authority of a civil servant vanished, replaced by the rigid tension of a law enforcement officer realizing he was standing in the middle of a federal crime scene. "What is this?" the fixer demanded, his voice pitching up an octave. "That's a civil custody order. You can't just override a family court judge with a piece of paper." "It's not a piece of paper," the deputy said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. He looked at the fixer. "It's a sealed federal indictment for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and money laundering, alongside a whistleblower immunity grant. Step back, now." The fixer froze. He looked at me, his face draining of color. "You didn't," he whispered. "I did," I replied, my tone conversational. I hadn't just filed a report. When Trent's cybersecurity team downloaded the poisoned seed for my honeypot, it didn't just scramble the shadow ledger. It triggered an automated, encrypted dead man switch. The moment they integrated the logic bomb, the system pinged the FBI's cybercrime division with a pre-packaged, fully translated dossier of the Sterling family's illicit transactions. Victoria's forensic team had spent the last 3 hours formatting my grandfather's raw data into a language federal prosecutors could use to secure an indictment before noon. I wasn't just a witness. I was the architect of their downfall. "Drop the folder," the deputy ordered, his hand resting casually on his duty belt. The fixer let the manila custody papers slip from his fingers. They hit the marble floor with a soft slap. "You don't understand," the fixer stammered, holding his hands up. "Helen Sterling paid me $50,000 to bring the boy in. I'm just a contractor. I didn't know about the ledger." "Ignorance isn't a defense for aiding in the obstruction of a federal investigation," the deputy said, pulling a pair of steel cuffs from his belt. "Turn around." As the deputy spun the fixer against the security desk, the radio on his shoulder crackled to life. "Unit 4, be advised. FBI HRT has breached the primary target location at the Sterling estate. Repeat, the residence is secure, but subjects Nathan and Helen Sterling are not on the premises. Suspects are currently mobile and unaccounted for." The deputy paused, his hand still on the fixer's wrist. He keyed his mic. "Copy, dispatch. Do we have a last known direction of travel?" "Negative, Unit 4. Their vehicles are still at the estate. Cell pings show them moving toward the financial district, specifically the brutalist sector, Cross-Tech Incubator." The deputy looked up at me, his eyes narrowing. "Your parents are coming here." "I know," I said. I hadn't felt a surge of triumph. I felt the cold, mechanical click of a trap finally snapping shut. My parents weren't coming here to apologize. They weren't coming to beg for forgiveness. They were coming because their empire had just evaporated, and the only physical object left in the world that could reverse the digital scramble and save them from federal prison was the brass cipher disk sitting on Victoria's glass desk. They needed the key, and they thought I was just a terrified, exhausted 24-year-old girl who would hand it over to save her son. The heavy, brushed steel doors of the private executive elevator at the back of the lobby chimed. It was the elevator that bypassed the main security desk and went directly to the underground parking garage. The digital floor indicator above the doors ticked downward. G, L2, L1. The doors slid open. Nathan and Helen Sterling stepped out into the lobby. The brushed steel doors of the private elevator slid open, but the atmosphere that spilled out into the lobby wasn't panic. It was absolute, glacial control. Nathan Sterling stepped first. His bespoke charcoal suit was immaculate, not a single hair out of place. He didn't look like a man whose $3 billion shadow ledger had just been scrambled by his 24-year-old daughter. He looked like a man who was used to making the world bend to his will. Behind him, my mother, Helen, stepped out in a tailored trench coat, her expression as smooth and unreadable as polished marble. They didn't look at the deputy. They didn't look at the handcuffed fixer. They looked only at me. "Nora," my father said, his voice a practiced boardroom baritone that echoed off the marble walls.
This little stunt is over. You've made your point. Hand over the brass disc and the decryption keys, and I will ensure the deputy walks away and forgets this ever happened." I didn't move. I kept my hand resting lightly on the handle of Toby's stroller. "The federal indictment is already filed, Dad. The deputy is just the local escort. The FBI is already at the estate." "The FBI is currently at the estate, yes, but they aren't looking for your father, Nora. They are looking for Trent." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I looked at her, processing the data. "Trent signed a full confession 20 minutes ago," Helen continued, her eyes locking onto mine. "He admitted to building the shadow ledger, routing the funds, and bypassing the board's oversight. He took the fall. The federal indictment has been amended. Your father and I are classified as cooperating witnesses who were unaware of their son's illicit activities. Trent is going to federal prison for 30 years. The company survives. The estate survives." A profound, icy clarity washed over me. My mother hadn't just built the mathematical models to hide the money, she'd built the legal escape route. She'd sacrificed her golden child to protect the patriarch and the empire. "You traded your son," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I protected the family," she corrected smoothly. "Which brings us to you. If you do not hand over that physical cipher disk right now, I will file for full custody of Toby. Not on medical grounds. I will file on the grounds that you are a domestic terrorist who just framed her own brother and attempted to extort the family. I will tie you up in family court for a decade. Toby will be in and out of state facilities while you fight a legal battle you cannot afford. You will lose, Nora, and you know it." I looked down at Toby. His dark eyes were tracking the fluorescent lights, his breathing steady and rhythmic. He was safe right now, but if I fought them today, I would be dragging him through 10 years of legal warfare. I would be trading his immediate stability for my revenge. I was a strategist. I didn't make emotional trades. "I will give you the disc," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "And I will sign a non-disclosure agreement. But in exchange, you will sign an irrevocable legal document severing all familial ties. You will relinquish any claim to Toby. You will never contact me, and you will never attempt to intervene in his life again. We become strangers, legally and permanently." My father's jaw tightened. "You want us to legally disown you?" "I want you to sign a 10-year no-contact order," I corrected. 10 years of absolute silence. If you violate it, the dead man's switch I build into the cloud server will automatically forward the unencrypted shadow ledger to the Wall Street Journal. It was a bluff. The switch was already destroyed, but he didn't know that. Nathan stared at me for a long, calculated moment. Then he nodded once. "Fine. 10 years. We draft the papers tonight." I reached into my coat, pulled out the heavy brass cipher disk, and placed it on the security desk. "Then we have nothing left to say to each other," I said. I turned my back on my parents, unlocked the stroller brake, and pushed my son toward the exit. I had just secured his safety. Now I had exactly 10 years to build an empire that would make them beg. I pushed Toby's stroller out of the Crosstech incubator and into the freezing Seattle rain. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind us, sealing away the empire I had just dismantled and the empire I was about to build. I had traded 10 years of my life for 10 years of peace. It was a calculated exchange. We didn't stay in the city. I liquidated the last of my assets and bought 2 bus tickets to a damp, working-class suburb on the outskirts of Portland. Our new home was a converted basement apartment that smelled perpetually of mildew and old pipes. The ceiling was so low I had to duck to reach the kitchenette. For the first 3 years, my life was reduced to a brutal, mechanical routine. From 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., I was a mother.
I administered Toby's feeding tubes, cleared his airways, and performed his physical therapy on a faded rug. From 2 p.m. to 6 p.m., he napped, and I slept. From 6 p.m. to 4 a.m., I was the CEO of Arthur Dynamics. I coded by the light of a single flickering desk lamp. My fingers blistered and bled from the cheap plastic keyboard. I ate rice and canned beans, calculating the exact caloric intake needed to keep my brain functioning while my body wasted away. There were no miracle breakthroughs. There were no sudden windfalls. There was only the grinding, unglamorous reality of building a legal, untraceable data routing architecture from scratch while keeping a medically fragile child alive. If you've ever had to build a life from nothing while the people who were supposed to help you watch you struggle, leave a comment below or share this with someone who needs to hear it. You aren't alone in the dark. By year 4, the financial pressure was suffocating. We were surviving on the revenue from small, localized logistics contracts. But then I discovered Toby's secret. He couldn't speak, he couldn't walk, but his brain processed visual data at a speed that defied medical science. One night, I was staring at a terminal screen, completely stuck in a recursive logic loop that was crashing my prototype. I was rubbing my eyes, ready to give up, when Toby, sitting in his specialized chair beside me, reached out with his left hand. He tapped the screen with his index finger right on a specific line of code. I looked at the screen. He had highlighted the exact variable causing the memory leak. I moved the code. The system compiled perfectly. From that day on, Toby was my silent partner. When I was blind to a structural flaw, he would tap the screen. He saw the rhythm in the chaos. He saw the patterns I missed. By year 7, Arthur Dynamics had patented the legal shadow routing protocol. We weren't just surviving, we were dominating the enterprise security sector. By year 9, we had quietly acquired 3 failing competitor firms, absorbing their talent and their client lists. And then came year 10. A global tech conglomerate approached us. They didn't want to buy the company, they wanted to buy the core architecture. The negotiation took 4 months. I didn't hire a flashy Wall Street banker. I negotiated the terms myself via encrypted video calls while Toby slept in his specialized bed in the corner of the room. When the final wire transfer cleared, my net worth sat at exactly $61 million. I didn't buy a yacht. I didn't buy a fleet of sports cars. I bought a fortress. I purchased a sprawling, single-story, fully accessible estate in the hills, equipped with a private medical wing for Toby and a subterranean server farm for my company. I bought freedom. I bought dignity. And then I waited. The 10-year no-contact order expired on a Tuesday. Exactly 11 years since the day I walked out of my parents' sunroom. I was sitting in my new office, reviewing the quarterly projections, when the heavy oak doors opened. My security chief stepped in, looking uneasy. "Mr. Sterling," he said quietly, "there's a man in the lobby. He doesn't have an appointment, but he gave this to give to you." The chief placed a thick, cream-colored envelope on my desk. It was sealed with a gold leaf wax stamp of the Sterling family crest. I opened the envelope, pulled out the heavy cardstock, and read the single line of text inside. Then I instructed my security team to let him up. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of my office opened again. Nathan Sterling walked in. He looked older, his hair entirely gray, his posture slightly less rigid. He walked to the center of the room, where a massive mahogany table sat, and placed his hands on the polished wood. He didn't look at my face, he looked at the table. "It's a family reunion, Nora," he said, his voice a practiced boardroom baritone. "At the estate, 3 weeks from now. We want you and the boy to attend. It's time to put the past behind us." "A family reunion," I repeated. My voice was soft, entirely devoid of inflection. I looked down at the heavy, cream-colored cardstock in my hand, tracing the gold leaf wax stamp with my thumb, and then looked back up at his face. You drove 3 hours from Newport to deliver a piece of paper in person? You didn't mail it, you didn't use a courier, you came yourself. Nathan adjusted his cuffs. It was a microscopic movement, but to my eyes, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was a nervous tell, a physical leak in his carefully constructed facade. It's a significant milestone, Nora. 11 years. Your mother and I feel it is time to make amends. We want to put the past behind us. You want to make amends, I corrected gently, leaning back in my leather chair. Or you want to make a transaction. He stiffened, his jaw tightening. I don't know what you're implying. I'm implying that you are wearing a suit that is at least 2 years old, tailored to a physique that has shrunk from stress. Your shoes, usually polished to a mirror shine, have a scuff on the left toe that you haven't bothered to buff out, and the pulse at the base of your throat is beating at roughly 110 beats per minute. You aren't here for a reunion, Dad. You're here because you are drowning. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the faint, rhythmic hum of the climate control system. I watched the exact moment his mask slipped. The arrogant patriarch vanished, replaced by a cornered, desperate man. How is the boy? He deflected, his voice losing its boardroom resonance, dropping into something thinner, weaker. Toby is in the East Wing undergoing his daily hydrotherapy. He is thriving, unlike Sterling Logistics. Nathan flinched. The physical recoil was subtle but undeniable. Without the shadow ledger to mask your offshore debts, and without the proprietary routing algorithm that Trent stole from my grandfather's notebooks, your core software is bottlenecking. Your major enterprise clients are migrating to Arthur Dynamics because our architecture is 10 times faster and entirely legal. You are currently facing a catastrophic liquidity crisis. You are exactly 19 days away from defaulting on your primary credit facility, which will trigger a cascade of margin calls that will bankrupt the estate. He stared at me, his eyes wide, the color draining from his face. How do you know that? The board meetings are closed, the financials are sealed. Because I am the one buying your debt. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick black leather folder. I didn't hand it to him. I simply placed it in the exact center of the mahogany table, sliding it across the polished wood until it stopped inches from his hands. Open it, I instructed. His hands trembled as he reached for the folder. He undid the clasp and opened the cover. I watched his eyes scan the first page. I watched him read the federal subpoena for the fraudulent transfer of assets. I watched him read the bank statements, showing the exact moment his primary lender sold his debt to a blind trust. And finally, I watched him read the deed of foreclosure. This, he stammered, his voice cracking. He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine for a lifeline. This trust, the one that bought my debt, the one that owns the estate now. Arthur Dynamics, I said. He dropped the invitation. The heavy cream cardstock fluttered to the floor, landing face up in the dust. The heavy cream cardstock lay face up on the polished mahogany, the gold leaf wax stamp catching the overhead light. Nathan stared at it, as if it were a live grenade. You bought the debt, he whispered, the boardroom baritone entirely gone, replaced by the thin, reedy voice of an old man. Through 3 separate blind trusts, incorporated in the Caymans, Delaware, and Nevada, I corrected gently. Sterling Logistics defaulted on its primary credit facility at 8 a.m. this morning. By 8:15, the holding company liquidated the debt. By 8:30, Arthur Dynamics purchased the estate's mortgage. As of this exact second, Dad, I own the house you are trying to invite me to. He gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles were white. "You can't do this. The estate has been in the Sterling family for 4 generations. It's our legacy, our bloodline." "Your bloodline," I repeated, the words tasting like ash and iron, "is exactly the problem." I reached into my drawer and pulled out a second, much thinner folder. I didn't slide it this time. I stood up, walked around the desk, and placed it directly over the dropped invitation. "When you disowned me, you claimed Toby's genetic defect didn't exist in our lineage. You implied I had been unfaithful. You used the illusion of my infidelity to justify throwing away your own grandson to protect the Sterling brand." Nathan's eyes darted to the folder, then back to my face. "I did what was necessary to protect the company." "You did what was necessary to protect your ego," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "Open it." He didn't want to. I could see the primal instinct in his muscles telling him to run, to refuse, to maintain the illusion. But the patriarch of the Sterlings was dead. Only a frightened old man remained. He opened the folder. Inside was a single, comprehensive genetic sequencing report from a private clinic in Zurich. "This is Toby's full genomic mapping, cross-referenced with the suppressed medical file you've been hiding since 1994, the one Victoria Cross gave me 11 years ago." Nathan's breath hitched. He stared at the highlighted DNA strands. "Toby didn't inherit a random mutation from David's side, nor did I introduce a foreign defect into your pristine bloodline. The variant 4 neurodegenerative marker is autosomal dominant. It came directly from you. Toby's genetic profile is a near-perfect match to your own suppressed diagnosis." The silence in the room was absolute. The air felt heavy, suffocating. "You didn't disown a bastard," I continued, my voice perfectly calm. "You disowned your own mirror. You threw away your grandson because his body was physically manifesting the exact genetic flaw you've spent 30 years and millions of dollars trying to hide from your board of directors." Nathan's hands began to shake. The folder slipped from his fingers, landing softly on the desk. He looked at me, his eyes wide, stripped of every lie he had ever told. "Where is Helen? She'll fix this. She always fixes this." "Helen is currently in a federal holding facility in Seattle," I replied smoothly. "The IRS seized her hidden offshore accounts at 6 a.m. She traded Trent to save you, Dad, but when the feds realized you were just a figurehead, they went after the actual architect. She's looking at 15 years. You're on your own." I leaned in, my face inches from his, and delivered the final, fatal blow. Because the genetic marker is legally classified as a pre-existing corporate health fraud, the Sterling Family Trust's moral turpitude clause was automatically triggered yesterday morning. The trust is legally voided. The estate, the liquid assets, the remaining corporate shares, they don't belong to you anymore, and they don't belong to me. They have been legally transferred to the sole living blood relative who carries the variant 4 marker. I paused, letting the weight of the words settle into his bones. "Toby owns the estate, Dad. The defective boy you threw into the rain is now your landlord, and as his legal guardian, I am formally serving you with an eviction notice." Nathan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grab the edge of the mahogany table to keep from collapsing to the floor. The pulse at his throat was beating so fast it looked like a spasm. He looked at me, his eyes wide, stripped of every lie he had ever told. The eviction notice I had just placed over his invitation.
Nathan stared at the eviction notice. The pulse at his throat fluttered, then slowed to a defeated, irregular rhythm. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. The patriarch of the Sterling Empire simply reached out with a trembling hand, picked up the cream-colored family reunion invitation from the floor, and carefully folded it in half. "You've won," he whispered. It wasn't a concession. It was an autopsy of his own pride. "I didn't play to win, Dad," I replied, my voice as calm as the day he threw me out. "I played to survive. There's a difference." He turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. His shoulders, usually held back in a rigid display of patriarchal authority, were slumped. He looked suddenly small, a man shrinking inside a suit that no longer fit. He didn't look back. When the doors clicked shut behind him, the sound was final. There was no triumph in my chest, no swelling music, no dramatic exhale of relief, just the quiet, mechanical click of a ledger finally balancing to zero. Over the next few months, the rest of the Sterling family met their natural conclusions. Helen was sentenced to 15 years in a federal facility. During her one allowed monitored phone call, she didn't apologize for the injunction, or the years of silence, or the genetic secret she had weaponized. She simply asked me to wire money for her commissary account, still viewing me as a utility. Trent was placed in a minimum security white-collar facility. His wife, Nicole, filed for divorce the day the indictment dropped, leaving him with nothing but his ego. Trent spent his time there trying to pitch a blockchain startup to the guards, still desperately seeking an audience. They never changed. They were entirely, hopelessly hollow. But I didn't need them to change. I just needed them gone. I left the office and walked down the long, sunlit hallway to the East Wing. The air here didn't smell of polished cedar or expensive perfume. It smelled of salt water and clean linen. I pushed open the door to the hydrotherapy room. Toby was suspended in the warm, chest-deep water of the therapeutic pool. His physical therapist was gently guiding his arms. Toby's eyes, one blue, one brown, were fixed on the ripples he was creating in the water. He tapped the surface with his index finger. Tap, tap, pause, tap. He was finding the rhythm. He always did. I sat on the edge of the pool, dipping my fingers into the warm water. My father had spent his entire life trying to curate a perfect image, pruning his family tree to remove anything that didn't look flawless. But he forgot the most basic rule of nature. A tree that only grows toward the sun without deep, messy roots in the dirt will fall in the first storm. He thought my worth was determined by his approval. He thought Toby's worth was determined by his physical utility. They were both wrong. True wealth isn't the money in a shadow ledger. It isn't the deed to a cliffside estate. True wealth is the quiet, unshakable knowledge that you belong to yourself. It is the resilience to build a fortress out of the stones they threw at you. It is looking at the people who discarded you and realizing you never needed their permission to be whole. Toby looked up at me, his mismatched eyes catching the light, and offered a small, deliberate smile. I smiled back. Remember, the people who disown you for your struggles are the exact same people who will try to claim you for your success. Choose your family wisely.